Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Daly. I'm the Chief Executive of the Grattan Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We should start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event takes place and acknowledge any elders past and present. And then I'd like to introduce the two people who've joined me this evening to talk about Grattan Institute's reading list for an Australian Prime Minister. First of all, I have Lee Sales, who will be very familiar to many of you. She anchors the ABC's flagship nightly current affairs program, 7:30. She's been a presenter for Lateline, and she was their Washington correspondent from 2001 to 2005. Apart from that, she's perfectly qualified for this evening because she formerly wrote a blog about books and reading called The Well-Read Head. And finally, of course, she's recently won a Walkley Award in 2012 for the best interviews for her work on 7:30, quizzing Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison and Christine Milne. And I'm delighted to have her in the opposite seat this evening because it means that I'm in this one. I'm also joined here by Jane Frances Kelly. She's the Program Director for the Cities Program of Grattan Institute and has authored reports such as The Cities We Need, Cities Who Decides, Social Cities, and The Housing We'd Choose. And I think they've been a terrific contribution to the debate in Australia about cities and how they work and what they do for us. Her previous career was advising governments on strategy, governments everywhere from Whitehall to Canberra and many other places in between. And doing this list was in fact her idea 4 years ago at Grattan Institute, because she had been involved in Whitehall essentially putting together the list for the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, where there was much internal debate about exactly what they should put in his box, and hopefully he would go away and read it. We won't ask whether in fact he did. We certainly won't ask whether there was a test afterwards. So tonight we have the summer reading list, and this is the fourth year that Grattan Institute has published this. And what we aim to do with this is to highlight a number of works that have been published recently that have got something to say to policymakers and that are well written, and therefore we hope will be a pleasure to read, partly for a Prime Minister and more importantly for many other people inside. We do in fact send the list and indeed the books to the Prime Minister, but we don't ask her whether she's read them, and we certainly don't administer a test. But we do hope that this is something useful for those who are interested in policy and something interesting for those who are related to those in policy, because if nothing else, we hope it will save that horrible problem about what to buy people for Christmas. So this evening, we've got 6 books that we'll talk about. And the first of those is The Words That Made Australia, edited by Robert Mann and Chris Falk. And it's a collection of extracts about what made us Australian, whatever that might mean, over our history. And it starts with Miles Franklin in 1901, writing about herself as a child of the mighty bush. And it finishes with Grattan Haig writing about the trees of his Lebanese family, planted in an Anglo backyard on Aboriginal land. So Jane Frances, as someone who is an Australian, but didn't necessarily come from here, what struck you about Lebanese families and Anglo backyards and Aboriginal land?
Well, one of the things I loved about this book, and being a new Australian of like 8.5 years standing now, you can tell by the accent and its transformation, is that it included a lot of voices from migrants, which was fantastic, from women. As you said, Miles Franklin was the first voice in the book. And Indigenous Australians, and I thought that the selection on Indigenous Australians was particularly good, although I'd probably love to have added Redfern, although it's probably unfair this week to make that comment. I spent a couple of midwinters up in Cape York working for Noel Pearson, and it was him who said to me, you know, pretty much on day one, you have to go and read Bill Stanner. You know, that's how you're going to kind of understand a bunch of the stuff that I'm talking about. And I think it's possible that this extract is out of a book that's out of print called White Man Got No Dreaming by Bill Stanner, which is a most extraordinary extraordinary book, and it would be great if it were kind of back in print. And kind of reading Stanner and Noel Pearson and so on meant that when I did first hear the Redfern speech, probably about 5 years ago, I understood it kind of so much better. It's also fascinating to me as a New Australian and also as a cities programme director to see what it says about suburbs. You know, there's it really kind of shows the love-hate relationship around suburbs, the polarisation of views that there is around suburbs. And of course, Australian suburbs are not one experience, you know, kind of one person's freedom and space to bring up a family is another teenager's desolate prison. And we do see both sides of that, as well as some of the polarisation in the book. And Hugh Stretton shows us all, you know, back in 1970, before I was born, that it is all a trade-off, and acknowledges that we don't all want the same thing, and luckily we have kind of, you know, more choices. Yeah, as a New Australian, it was an absolute pleasure to learn more about my new country.
I mean, certainly I think one of the things it illustrates is how much Australia has changed. You know, our image started off with the bush, went to the suburbs, now a lot of it's about the inner city. We started with an Anglo focus. I mean, Metin in 1908 was writing about, you know, it's an English society which exists in the Antipodes. And, you know, today we've got Malouf writing about, you know, a loosely Mediterranean style of living. A world in which, you know, it used to be all about masculine mateship to obviously a much more gender plural world, from Aboriginal protection and segregation to, you know, black armbands to Noel Pearson talking about passive welfare. You know, clearly, although our image is that Australia is boring and nothing's ever happened in 100 years, it's a radically different place. So, Lee, which things struck you as having changed most?
Look, I must say the main thing that struck me reading this book was that I was delighted with the inclusion of an extract from the D.H. Lawrence novel Kangaroo. And the reason that I was pleased about that is because I think that I meet a lot of people who work in policy and who work in politics who don't read fiction. And I've had a friend say to me, well, why would I read fiction? He sees it as a waste of his time. And I think that's a terribly sad attitude, because fiction, I think, sparks our imagination and it puts us in touch with people's emotion. I'm sure we've all seen, every now and again, a newspaper will run a piece about politicians and what are their favourite books, and people will say, 1984 or Hamlet, and you think, well, have you read anything since grade 12? So I was delighted to see the D.H. Lawrence extract in there, and it was the book was in part inspired by a visit that he made to Australia, and he was clearly not a great fan of Australia and was quite homesick for England. He described Australia as this London of the Southern Hemisphere, which is a poor substitute for the real thing, as margarine is for butter. I think also it's fascinating to get the insights of a foreigner into your own country, because they bring sometimes, I think, a clarity and a sharp way of looking at things that sometimes we can't see ourselves. And there was an extract in this section of Kangaroo where he writes about the bush, which Australians have a very romantic notion of in part. And I just wanted to read it because it's such a fantastic piece of writing. Therefore, he lets himself feel all sorts of things about the bush. It was so phantom-like, so ghostly, with its tall, pale trees and many dead trees, like corpses, partly charred by bushfires. And then the foliage so dark, like grey-green iron. And then it was so deathly still. Even the few birds seemed to be swamped in silence, waiting. The bush seemed to be horribly waiting. And he could not penetrate its secret. He couldn't get at it. Nobody could get at it. What was it waiting for? When I read that, felt like that's exactly how I feel about the bush, you know, it's quite menacing to me. The other thing in this collection that leapt out at me was an extract from Paul Kelly's book, The End of Certainty. It really jumped out at me. He talks a lot about the White Australia policy and how central it was to Australia across the decades. And it was just really interesting reading it in light of the debate that we've been having recently about asylum seekers, and thinking that even though that policy was dismantled many years ago, it's quite amazing how just ingrained that is in the nation's psyche, and how even today I think some of the ideas and fears that underpinned White Australia still run through our society.
And Lee, there's also a lovely extract in it from Hancock about what kind of democracy Australia is. Do you think he's still right?
He writes in that essay that Australia is a society and a country that's always had a need for strong government, that's a hallmark of our democracy. He quotes somebody who says, new countries always demand ample government. And Australia was a country like that. People had relocated from a great distance. They didn't have any of those institutions anymore. They didn't have the regular social structures. So basically, new settlers expected collective action, and they expected the state to basically run that. And so Hancock's view is that the Australian democracy has its genesis in the view that the state is a vast public utility, and I think that feeds into another of our books too.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's interesting if you look at the Paul Kelly extract about the end of certainty, where he lays out what was the Great Australian Settlement from 1901. High tariffs, gone. White Australia, gone, with the right of it you raised. Industry protection, gone. Wage arbitration, more or less gone. Imperial benevolence, certainly not the same empire. But the one piece that's still there is state paternalism. And I guess that's what Laura picks up in Great Expectations. Is that how you read it?
That's right. And, she touches on something that I read a columnist in the Daily Telegraph, David Penberthy, write about a while ago, when there'd been a series of shark attacks in Sydney, and everyone was going, well, what's the government going to do about it? And Penbo said in his piece, well, what do you want them to do? Come out with the slogan, tough on sharks, tough on the causes of sharks? So Laura Tingle's essay, which was really a wonderful, very crisply written book with a very clear argument and very well supported by historical evidence, goes through this idea that Australians have great expectations of their government and that we demand a lot from them. And she traverses some of the territory that's in The Words That Made Australia, running through our history as to why this has been the case, why we've developed this national identity that we sort of fear a little bit like we're being ripped off and that somebody's coming to take our stuff away from us, to take our land or to take our jobs. So she runs through that, and there's some really lovely stuff in it where she talks about Governor Macquarie perhaps being the first leader about whom Australians grizzled for doing both too much and too little. And so once she's gone through the history of why Australians ask a lot from their government, she talks about, well, what should we do about that?
Now, you've interviewed a lot of our leaders. Do you think they've changed?
It's interesting because reading Laura's essay, she talks about Hawke and Keating and the enormous changes they had to make with the economy to deregulate. And I was reflecting on it and thinking how hard, I was too young to remember that firsthand. I remember Bob Hawke as Prime Minister, but I don't remember the details of it. I was thinking how hard they must have had to work to persuade the nation that dismantling protectionism was really in our national interest. And it's made me wonder today, I see lots of examples of where politicians put out a policy and the public reaction's negative, and so they back away from it, and then they might change their mind back again. And I think that, sometimes the electorate respects people who I think actually stand for something and push it, all the way through. So it was interesting to read Laura's essay in light of that. And I think also the other thing that came through to me was that politicians create part of this problem themselves. It's not just that the public expects a lot. Politicians build people's expectations, particularly in election campaigns. And we just saw it in the United States over the past 4 years with President Obama, where people felt very disillusioned about, the sort of sweeping mantra of hope and change that he came in with, and then, a lot of people felt didn't deliver on. We're going to see it in Australia increasingly in the election campaign. Already, so many promises have been made without any idea of how they're going to be funded, and sadly, that will only get worse and build expectations further.
The only comment I had to make on this is that I think it is a particular Australian phenomenon, these great expectations, but Australia's not the only country where people expect a lot of their government. So, Bush came under a lot of criticism for, underreacting to Katrina. In the UK, people are looking to government to pick up what insurance companies are not doing anymore in terms of flood insurance and so on. So, yeah, we in Australia are not completely Robinson Crusoe on that.
Do you think there's any chance that someone in an Australian government will level with the people and say, actually, there's a bunch of things we can't do?
They'll probably have to at some point because they're just not going to have the money. So at some point, someone will have to figure that out, unless they can figure out a way to inject a lot of cash into the economy. But I think they will. I was just going to say, picking up on Jane's point, when I was Washington correspondent, I covered Hurricane Katrina and I had to go down to New Orleans. And it was in the era after September 11 when I was posted there. I got in just after September 11. And we were always getting these things from the government, you should stock up your house with water and duct tape and plastic and all this sort of stuff. And I used to live 1 kilometre from the White House, and I thought, if anything happens, either I'll be dead or, the government will come because they're only 1 kilometre away. And then I went down to cover Hurricane Katrina and I realised the government does not come. So I went home and stocked up on water and duct tape as demanded.
Well, I guess that leads us maybe to the next book in terms of Kinglake 350. So, Jane Frances, why don't you tell us about this one?
Yeah, so this is an extraordinary book. I read it in one sitting. I was down in a friend's place in the bush west of Melbourne. I'm glad it was winter when I read it, but I essentially sat down about 10 in the morning, and I got up once, I think, to go to the loo, and once to pick up, it was a wee bit cold, and I went to pick up a shawl from the bedroom I was staying in. I was so addicted to, this book is so compellingly written that I got up to go into the bedroom to pick up a shawl, and I walked with the book open in front of me. And it's not true that I kind of banged into the wall, but I nearly did. It was, you just couldn't put it down. And the friend I was staying with, when she saw how engaged I was in the book, I had to leave mid-afternoon the next day. She got up at about 7 in the morning so that she could read it before I had to leave with the book. So that's kind of how compelling it is. It's an extraordinary work. I think it conveys something of the terror. It's a careful non-fiction account, but you can tell that Hyland has drawn on his skills as a novelist to make sort of the level of tragedy somewhat approachable by using an imaginative account of a dying family, which was harrowing and dignifying as well. The other thing I found so refreshing about this book is that by following a local police officer and other locals on Black Saturday, it takes a very different kind of approach from a lot of the reaction to the fires, which, were like the Royal Commission and so on, which were examinations that were set up to be adversarial and assign blame and so on. And this book essentially kind of is able, therefore, to approach the kinds of truths which are just as important, but which you can't get at in those types of inquiries.
Lee?
I also thought this was a fantastic book. It was my favourite of the selection. I couldn't stop reading it. I was up till 1 o'clock in the morning reading it, and then I couldn't sleep because it was so chilling and terrifying. It was, as JFK says, it's partly particularly compelling because of the way in which it's written, which is a style called narrative non-fiction, which means it basically reads like a novel, but it's non-fiction. And so it follows the tale of this policeman, Roger Wood. That's the spine of the story, and then everything else sort of hangs off that spine. It dips in and out of other things. And the fire itself, it basically reads like a horror novel because the fire itself is pretty much a character, this sort of menacing, at a lot of the time unseen character that you're waiting to come and attack, like a monster basically. So it was a very chilling book. The effect of the fact that it was written like a novel meant that I felt like I retained a huge amount of information from it because it has all these fascinating little anecdotes about things to do with bushfires and also arson in Australia. There's a section that was particularly interesting about arson. It says that there are 54,000 bushfires around Australia each year. Experts now believe 20 to 30,000 of those are deliberately lit, which is very chilling because we live in a very fire-prone nation. Arson costs Australia about $1.6 billion a year. It has an enormous environmental impact. The 2003 fires, for instance, increased this country's carbon emissions by 1/3. There are only convictions for about 1% of deliberate ignitions. So that was incredibly fascinating reading that.
There was a lovely part of that, which is of those people who are convicted, they all have, these by and large very poor backgrounds, very low self-esteem, very low rates of earning. And then it says, on the other hand, maybe that's just because they're the ones who get caught.
Well, this was part of the problem that the book explains, that it's very difficult to catch these people because obviously the evidence is frequently destroyed. Something else that stuck with me was that 27% of Black Saturday victims were found in the bath, and that it's a myth that the bath is the safest place to go in the house. Most people die in the bathroom because there are no escape routes other than the door into the bathroom. So look, it's full of interesting things like that. One other thing that stuck with me was that there have been many inquiries after devastating bushfires like this, and in fact in 1939, after the Black Friday fires, many of the same recommendations were made as the recent Royal Commission made, and yet they weren't put into place.
Yeah, I think it makes us wonder whether we do the right things with those Royal Commissions. I mean, maybe next time, and I fear there will be a next time because that's the nature of the world, there's a really big fire. The thing that the Royal Commissioner should do on day one is walk in a little bit like Fitzgerald did in Queensland and say, we're not going to bother investigating the causes of this fire and what we can do about it because we actually already know, and let's instead work out what's wrong with our institutions that means we never get around to dealing with the things that we've been told time and time again need to change.
So, a reasonable, we've talked about how kind of compelling and how much we've learned from this book. It has transformed my understanding of what I have learned is, living in the most bushfire-prone area of the world as a southeast triangle in Australia. But why for the Prime Minister? I think it just teaches us so much about our country and ourselves in a really kind of compelling way.
I mean, it does tell us a lot about wildness, and I guess that brings us to our next book, which is The Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. And in it, what she does is talk about essentially what is wildness for, what is wilderness, and in particular, I guess, what she's having a go at is the idea that there is such a thing as pristine wilderness. That was certainly where the wilderness movement started in Yellowstone in the US. But if you look at our world today, you can't find anywhere in the world that hasn't been materially changed, and more to the point, can never go back to this kind of pristine thing. In particular, there used to be basically large animals pretty much everywhere around the world. More or less when humans arrived, wherever they arrived in the world, they killed them off, and huge numbers of species just don't exist anymore that did exist 100,000, 200,000 years ago. Pretty much anywhere in the world these days has got a substantial number of introduced species. Climate change means that a lot of environments just aren't the same anymore. The fact that there's intervening cities between any two areas means that it just can't go back. And therefore she's essentially saying, we've got this image of wilderness, but there ain't no such thing. One of the things she finishes up with is talking about nature in urban areas. And
basically, she carries you along to the point where you think, okay, her argument is that there is no such thing as a pristine wilderness, and that what we would consider pristine wildernesses, is the wildernesses, the plural, are actually very heavily managed because they have to be to keep invasive species out of them. So once she carries you to that point, she basically makes the argument that, we can have a wilderness anywhere or a rambunctious garden anywhere. So she has this really interesting example of a river in Seattle in the United States, which basically goes through the centre of Seattle, and it has heavy industrial areas all around it, and it's in very bad shape. So people in Seattle have decided the river, you could never get it back to what it actually was, and they want to keep industry in these areas. So they're trying to actually introduce areas of nature around the industrial area. So there were these really interesting things that she had about setting up on I think it's Boeing has got one of their buildings there, setting up on the roof of Boeing a green roof where you create a habitat for plants and bugs, and you replicate shallow soil systems on the roof that suit things like orchids and ground nesting birds. She talks about industrial buildings often have a lot of exposed concrete walls, and then using those for cliff-dwelling species of vines and birds of prey and things like that. Salty wastewater pools, introducing birds and salt-loving plants into that environment. So basically just thinking as creatively as you can to get some nature into places where traditionally we wouldn't think of as natural in any way. So instead of thinking as your city as, here's the industrial area and here's the park, trying to integrate it all a little more.
I mean, I think one of the things that's also really interesting is she has a lovely last chapter talking about what are the purposes of environmental policy, and I don't think that's something we talk about very often. It's just kind of like, well, it's green and cuddly, that must be okay. And instead she really breaks it apart and says, look, what we're trying to do is a series of different things, and they're not actually all perfectly aligned. We're trying to preserve, as many species as possible. We're trying to preserve as many different ecosystems as possible. We're trying to preserve what she describes as the charismatic megafauna, which is the best euphemism I've ever heard for cute and cuddly. We're trying to prevent extinctions. We're trying to promote species diversity in any one particular place. We're trying to promote environmental services. We're trying to promote just aesthetic environments. And I think what she does really well is just tease each of these different purposes apart and say, look, environmental policy is about serving all of these ends in different ways at different times to different extents. And I just think that's such a sophisticated way of talking about environmental policy, and it would be great if we saw a bit more of it.
Bet a lot of environmentalists would find it very controversial.
Yeah, they will find it controversial, and I think, but this is someone who has done a huge amount of writing for Science and for Nature. She's visited most of these places. She's clearly passionate about the environment. She's just got a really sophisticated view of, well, what can you do? When most of Hawaii is overrun by invasive species, hacking it all down, number one, is impractical, and number two, it wouldn't leave much anyway. That takes us, as you said, to urban environments, because she does finish up with urban environments, and that, I guess, takes us to The New Geography of Jobs by Enrico Moretti, which is essentially about where are jobs and where are cities. Jane Frances, this is your patch. What did you take away?
I mean, I do love nature as well, and all respect to her for using the word rambunctious in a title as well. It's just fantastic. So just a quick kind of précis of what Moretti is talking about in this book. He's essentially saying that industries that depend on human ingenuity are driving growth, jobs growth in America. So internet businesses, scientific research, finance industries, and so on. And we're expecting the rollout of the NBN in Australia, and, there was supposed to be the death of distances, and, Thomas Friedman said the world was flat and so on. But despite all of that hype, Moretti points out that in these jobs, it's actually more important than ever that people work face-to-face. It's how that kind of work is done. They don't have to be face-to-face all the time, but a significant amount of it does. And one of the things that is resulting in America is, and I'll come back to the implications for Australia, is that high-value jobs that are done by people who are highly educationally qualified are bunching together in America, and American cities are increasingly diverging by education qualification, and that kind of segregation looks like it's only going to continue growing. And he says that those knowledge-intensive jobs are also important because they have a strong multiplier effect, not just for people in highly skilled work, like lawyers and bankers and so on, but also for more low-skilled positions. And those low-skilled jobs pay more in the cities which are hooked into this kind of economy. And so, far from becoming less important, where people live and what jobs they have access to matters more than ever. Now, that's America, right? America is not Australia. I'll say it again, America is not Australia. But there is a phenomenon in Australia which we've kind of been noticing for a while, that in major Australian cities we are seeing a growing polarisation of where people live who have different levels of education qualification. And so given that the economy in Australia is evolving in the same kind of direction towards more knowledge-intensive industries as it is in the States, we really kind of need to ask some questions triggered by this. It will express itself very differently in Australia. We don't have the many mid-sized cities that they have in the US, but we really need to kind of ask a question of, is the structure of our cities potentially dampening kind of the amount of economic activity and growth and productivity we should be expecting? And do people have the access to opportunities that we want them to have, that the fair go requires? And so we're doing that work right now.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah, and I think one of the things that is not well known is the way that not only do we have this segregation about where people live into essentially higher incomes in the centre, lower incomes on the outside, but we also have a segregation about where people work. That those people on the edges of our cities actually, by and large, don't work in the centre of our cities. It's often as low as 2 or 3% from the outer suburbs working in the kind of...
But it's important that they should have access to those higher value
Absolutely,
jobs,
but that's my point, is that it's becoming very segregated.
Yeah.
Lee, which stories did you take away from this?
Look, I was just going to elaborate on the multiplier effect stuff that Jane Frances alluded to, because it was just really interesting when they actually gave examples of how that works. So one of the examples was about San Francisco, and where Twitter is headquarters, and it said that for every one software design job that's created at Twitter, it creates 5 additional jobs outside the high-tech sector: waiters, hairdressers, yoga teachers, lawyers, doctors, and so on. Apple in Cupertino directly employs 12,000 workers, but through the multiplier effect, it generates an additional 60,000 jobs for that economy. There was also a really interesting historical example about Microsoft and the decision when it was made about where to headquarter Microsoft. It originally started in Albuquerque in New Mexico, but Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who were the founders of Microsoft, were both from Seattle, and so they wanted to move back to Seattle. So they made the decision to relocate Microsoft from Albuquerque to Seattle for no other reason other than that they were from Seattle.
And that was in the days when Seattle was falling
Seattle
apart.
Had a manufacturing base, and it was not a very happening city. It was quite a strange decision, actually, to move from Albuquerque, which at the time was a very strong city. But that occurred in the 1970s, and it has had profound impacts for both Seattle and Albuquerque, because it's helped turn Seattle into an innovation hub with all those extra jobs due to the multiplier effect. And the most stark example of what's gone on is that in 1970, the number of college-educated workers in Seattle was only about 5% higher than Albuquerque. Today, it's 45%.
Well, and one of the things that I loved about it was a little piece about waiters. So if you take the 10 cities in the United States in which waiters get paid the most, 7 of them are high-tech cities. And that, I guess, is, if you like, the human story behind the more detailed statistics he's got about these cities, looking at what percentage of the people in the city have high levels of education. And essentially, as you were saying, Jane Frances, in cities with high proportions of the population have high levels of education, then they get paid more, and the people without higher education get paid more.
And the other thing that means is that the house prices go up in those cities, and so if you're have lower education qualifications and you're from a city that is not hooked into that economy, you are essentially getting increasingly locked out because you can't afford to move to that city. And again, I think that should trigger questions for us. The last thing I'll say about this, you can get through this book in a few hours. It's really well written and entertaining, and it's full of data, which we like. But not too full of data. The books which ended up in the list, we go through this process at Grattan of starting with 40 books or whatever, and we all kind of read stuff and so on. This book is probably, of all the books on the list, been the most high demand at Grattan. I think at least 10 people have read it. The refrain, "Who's got a Moretti?" is quite common at Grattan. And Lee will attest that the copy that we posted to her is covered in notes and page turns and so on. And we've already said to her downstairs, "Can we have that one back, please? And we'll give you another one."
Yeah. So that takes us to a rather thicker book, which is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. Lee, how do you think differently about thinking, having read it?
This was also a fascinating book, probably my second favourite after the Kinglake book, and I kept wishing to skim it because it was so thick, but it just kept sticking its tentacles into me. I couldn't get away from it. So to sort of summarise very broadly what it's about the way that we think and reason, and he describes your brain as 2 separate things, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, intuitive, unconscious. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical and effortful. So when I say to you, salt and, the word pepper springs to your mind without you thinking about it, and you almost can't stop the word pepper springing to your mind if I say salt and. System 2 is what activates when I ask you to work out in your head 27 times 13. You can't, it doesn't, unless you're a genius, it doesn't automatically spring to mind. Now, most of the time in our lives we rely on System 1, and most of the time it works very effectively for us. System 2 is lazy and it tires very easily. But System 1 is subject to all sorts of cognitive biases, and Daniel Kahneman has spent his career studying these biases. And when I tell you some of them, you will think, oh, I don't do that. But really sound research indicates that you do. So, for example, one is the halo effect. If you see a sportsman who is good looking, you will be inclined to think that he's going to be good at sport. Good looking people we think are going to be good at what they do, which often isn't the case. Another one that was really interesting was he talks about a bias. He did a famous experiment called the Linda experiment to illustrate this. So what he says is, so that the situation presented to a group of people was that Linda is single, outspoken, very bright, and as a student she was very concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice. What is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. 85% of Stanford grad school business students said B based on the information that was provided. Linda is probably a bank teller and a feminist. But that conclusion defies the basic laws of probability that we all understand pretty well, because every feminist bank teller is a bank teller. So adding that extra layer of detail only actually reduces the probability. So often we can be provided with extraneous information that we don't really need, and that leads us to draw an inaccurate conclusion. The best example I can think of faulty System 1 thinking is President George W. Bush, who was known for reliance on gut and publicly said on numerous occasions that he relied on gut to make decisions, said of the Russian President Vladimir Putin that he looked him in the eyes and took the measure of the man. But gut, relying on instinct and relying on gut does work sometimes, but only if you have experience in your life that gives you sufficient expertise that your gut is reliable. So in that case, George Bush, he didn't have any experience of being a president or working in foreign policy, so gut is not a very reliable... You
need an informed gut.
Exactly. So gut is not a very reliable indicator. Malcolm Gladwell in his book Blink talks about, he hypothesises that you need about 10,000 hours of experience at something before your gut is a reliable indicator. There are examples of great tennis coaches who can tell if a serve is going to be a fault from the second the racket hits the ball. If you pause the shot there, they'll be able to tell you straight away if it's going to be a fault, because they've watched so many great serves that they just know instinctively from their gut what's going to happen. So this book, it runs through, I don't know, there must be 24 of these cognitive processes that cause your gut to be not quite so reliable.
Jane Frances, you were lucky enough to study under Daniel.
But it wasn't me who first suggested this, I promise. I think this is great because if you want to know more about how we function as human beings and how it affects our decisions, including as economic actors, this is essentially the state of the art of behavioural economics, and therefore incredibly important for someone like a Prime Minister to understand. There's two things that makes me think of. When about 10 years ago, I was working with a young government economist in London, and we were working on early years policy, and he'd produced this really kind of beautifully robust economic paper on how young single mothers perhaps behaved and so on. And I kind of said, this is great, but there is another discipline which seeks to understand human behaviour, which is psychology. It would be great if we could bring some of those insights into the economics as well. And he said to me, Jane Frances, if I could build the bridges between psychology and economics, I'd win the Nobel Prize, but we've got 4 hours to get this report out, which was the best bit of upward management I've ever known. That shot me up instantly, basically. And it was 2 years after that Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics. He's a psychologist. As I said, I was taught by him at Princeton because when I did a policy degree there, they made psychology, applied psychology for policy making, a required course along with economics and statistics, and I thought it was a good thing. He's a gifted teacher and a charming man, and this comes through in spades in his writing. You'll enjoy his company in the book.
Yeah, no, it's a terrific book. Now, what we won't talk about for too long is something that we've added for the first time at the end of this, which is the summer reading list for wonks. So what we've been talking about tonight are the books that we hope will be read by people who watch the 7:30 report, and this is the list for people who watch the Late Line. So for those of you who are serious policy tragics, there's a whole string of things here. Max Corden's piece on the Dutch disease in Australia, which is a terrific romp through what's really going on in terms of structural change in Australia, and more to the point, what governments can or can't do about it. The Resolution Foundation's report on gaining from growth, which is essentially about what's happening to lower and particularly middle United Kingdom and what governments can do about it. Jeff Borland's piece on industrial relations and the extent to which there really is a problem, which is a really exhaustive attempt to go through a whole series of issues which people talk about in terms of industrial relations and actually try and get the numbers and evidence behind them. A piece about Towards a New Financial Language, which is actually, although it's talking about financial language, is actually about standards and the role of government in setting standards, and how often that business of setting standards can be a key thing in terms of changing how things work. We've talked a lot about the fact that we have too many expectations of governments, and this is something where I think governments, if anything, perhaps underrate their ability to have an impact in the long term. Atul Gavanda's Big Med, I will confess I'm a complete Gavanda fan. If I could be a surgeon as good as him, a policymaker as good as him, or write as well as him, I would die very happy. But there's no guarantee of any of those three things. And this is his piece about how medicine is organised, and historically it's been a bit of a cottage industry in terms of its organisation, and just asking about, are there better ways of organising it? And very famously he draws a really interesting comparison between restaurants that we all go to and an outfit in the US called the Cheesecake Factory, which despite its name is in fact a relatively upmarket restaurant, but it's a restaurant chain. They do things exactly the same in every single
But
store.
for like 450 menu items or something.
Yeah, but with
like
450 menu items, and with every single item actually cooked fresh on the premises from the original ingredients. It's a really extraordinary business model. Madmen, Intellectuals and Academic Scribblers, which is this book, which for those of you who have forgotten all of the public choice theory that you learnt in university, it's a terrific romp back through that and just reminding ourselves of the way that politics inevitably delivers outcomes that are not necessarily in the public interest. And then very interestingly where it goes is to talk about that sometimes ideas can actually trump the politics and the special interest, and it's really interested in how does that sometimes happen. And then finally a piece on how stereotypes can drive women to quit science, talking about the way that we stereotype people and how our very own, the stereotypes of ourselves can lead to us making choices. Most of those are available on the web, and you'll see that the web addresses are there. So that's this year's reading list. As you can see, Grattan Institute and those from Grattan Institute have had enormous opportunity to make choices about what we think would be useful for a Prime Minister to read. But I guess what we'd be fascinated to hear is what you as an audience think ought to be there but isn't. So if I can ask you to volunteer, anyone who has got a suggestion of a book that should be here but isn't, and why would you add it to the list? We have roving microphones, so anyone who has a suggestion, please put up your hand. What's missing from the list? What should we have added on for the Prime Minister, and why?
Would you add anything, Jane?
Jane Francis?
No, I was involved in.
Well, Lee, what would you have added
choice,
on?
So.
Look, in all honesty, if I were designing the Christmas reading list for the Prime Minister, I would say get away from it all with a couple of trashy Hollywood biographies and some back issues of Vanity Fair. That's what I'm going to be reading. And I know that this is going to sound a bit sucky, but the book I actually, would have liked to see on it was James Button, who works at the Grattan Institute's book, Speechless, A Year in My Father's Business, which was really just an excellent book, and it really taught me some stuff that I didn't know about the way government works, and particularly the way public service works. And a bit like Adrian Hyland's book, it was just such a compelling personal story that it really held your attention all the way through. So I thought that was a great book about Australian public life and the way we make policy.
And also contained a lot about, the morality of a choice to be a journalist rather than a politician.
Yeah, it was a really great book. I loved it.
Maybe we should ask James what you think. Oh, there's one there.
We have one over
so
here.
So beside James, there's a...
And then we'll go up the back there. Thank you.
Mine is a classic. It's not from this year. I don't know if that disqualifies me from entering it. But I think that Strunk and White, the style guide on how to write, would be so useful for anyone even vaguely involved in politics, which includes the Prime Minister. I think that everything that I ever read that comes from Canberra is full of holes.
Thank you.
That point's made very effectively in James Button's book as well, that people, both in terms of public speaking, giving speeches and writing, don't actually understand what good communication is. And it's not reading big, long, policy wonk type sentences. It's talking clearly.
Thank you.
Mine's not from this year either, but definitely the best book that I've read this year that changed the way I thought about a lot of areas of policy was, I can't remember the author, but The Brain That Changes Itself, in terms of its implications for disability policy, aged care, health, a whole lot of areas, basically debunking the myth that our brains and the way we think are set in stone as children, and that we then have to manage with the limitations of that, and turning that on its head and providing a lot of evidence about what can be done to change your brain as an adult or post-injury for that matter.
It's Norman Doidge. There's hope for us all.
And I guess particularly given the comments we had earlier about the need for Australian leadership to adopt a different tack, maybe that's exactly what we need. I think we've got one up the back here. Is that right? Yeah. No? Sorry, okay, I'm sorry.
Right down the front now.
Right down the front. Sorry, we'll get to you as fast as we can. Any others, just so we can kind of get the microphone to where it needs to be? There's one down the front here that we're coming to. Who would like to go after that?
There's a gentleman there.
And there's one gentleman
with the
just...
blazer in the white T-shirt. He's had his hand up, yeah.
Thank you.
Mike's
Sorry, can you just...
I think now it's working. There we are. All right. The other book I suggested, one that came out very recently by Nicholas Nassim Taleb. It's called Anti-Fragile. It's a fantastic book about, I guess, how we live in a world which is incredibly complex. It's effectively a guide on how to live in this world that we understand. We understand a lot less of it than we would like to think that we understand.
Thank you. That one there.
My suggestion would be Collapse by Jared Diamond. It's a book about how societies have in the past, how their decisions have led to their eventual demise, such as the Mayans, such as those on Easter Island. And it's also got some really interesting chapters about contemporary Australia and China. I think it would be quite pertinent given climate change and other threats like that.
Thank you. And then we've got one just behind you, I think.
Yeah, Robert, man.
Yep, Robert, I think. Just there, thank you.
Yeah, can I be heard? Just about Stana, I was going to say that if anyone does want to follow Stana, we, Black Ink, published basically White Man Got No Dreaming under the title The Dreaming and Other Essays. So,
yes, no, I do have that, yeah. It was the rest of it I really wanted.
Yeah. But I do think the Prime Minister and everyone else should think, in part at least, about climate change, which seems to me the overwhelming issue, of our lifetime, my lifetime. A book that I learned a lot from, I found fascinating, was from one of the people at the centre of the wars, Michael Mann, the hockey stick wars, which I found really illuminating. I was surprised that a scientist had political savvy beyond most political scientists, and I found it very interesting, so I'd put that in.
Thank you. Next. Got one up the front here, please, Emma.
It's so much easier to sit up here and go.
If we're going with oldies but goodies, I'd recommend Peter Doherty's How to Win a Nobel Prize. I think the saddest part of that book was he did his Nobel Prize winning work in Australia and then he left. Wasn't kept. So if we're interested in climate change, if we're interested in promoting science, we need to think about how we do that economically.
Yeah, although it would be a fantastic thing for a country to have somebody who had won a Nobel Prize, although I suppose Czechoslovakia had a president that had won a Nobel Prize.
No, Václav Havel actually turned it down the year that he was kind of offered it because Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest at the time. I used to work for Olga Havel, and she told me that story, but she was probably biased.
Barack Obama's got one.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyone else? Yes, we've got one over here.
Thank you. One book I would recommend that is so very rooted in 2012 that it's not available in paperback, it's just an ebook. That was The Rent is Too Damn High by Matthew Iglesias. It's more of a neoliberal take on how housing can be reformed to improve the well-being of low-income households, actually, and how housing affordability is often propped up by regulations, or rather it's unaffordable because of restrictions on land use, because of restrictions on building, and limitations on how we can build in such a way that restricts the supply of housing, keeps house prices high, and that invariably hurts low-income houses more than rich income houses. So I think that would be a very pertinent follow-on from the geography of jobs, and very salient to Australia, where house prices are such a critical issue.
This is an intern at Grattan this year, and so we'll definitely get you. We'll get you reading The Housing We Choose, What Matters Most, and Getting the Housing We Want, because I don't think your analysis is quite right, but read the Grattan research.
So, Lee, as someone who used to blog about books, what would you take away from all of this? What would you?
I thought you were going to ask me what was just the most interesting book I'd read this year, which had nothing to do with public policy.
Oh, well, no, tell us that.
No,
then.
it was a book called I can't remember what the title of it was actually, but it was by Tyler Hamilton, who was a cyclist on Lance Armstrong's team. Now, I know nothing about cycling. I could. The Secret Race. I could care less about sport, but it was so interesting. It was unputdownable. I had to skim it because I was interviewing Tyler Hamilton and I didn't have much time. And I started reading it and I said to my producer, we're in trouble because I can't skim it. So we tore it in half and he took the back half and I did the front half. But it's so fascinating about how you go into a sport as an idealistic young person and end up becoming a drug cheat and you don't actually see it as cheating. Oh my God, it was just absolutely fantastic. What did I take away from all of these? Look, they were all so diverse. It's hard to say, one message, other than that I think we need to be more thoughtful, I suppose, and more bold in the policy decisions that we make.
Do we read enough books in our policy life?
Well, I think probably not. I think that the pace of public life is so fast now that people don't have time to actually sit back and read and think. I think there was wasn't there a conversation that was inadvertently broadcast between, I think, Barack Obama and David Cameron, where Barack Obama was talking about the need to have actual thinking time and to carve out thinking time. And I think, sadly, for a lot of our political leaders, there is not a lot of it.
Because, I think one of the things that many people talk about, and I guess Laura Tingle talks about in her piece, is the way that, our politics just doesn't, in a funny way, it's not making very much progress. Maybe it links back to Kahneman. We're thinking fast the whole time. And, you can see the kind of imperatives to do that every minute of every day. But as he points out, you don't get very much done when you think fast.
The other thing that did leap out at me, I think, in the essays book and in Laura's book, and those two mainly, was how essays that were written in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, how people identified some of the national traits that you still see in Australia today, and were quite pessimistic and anxious about how the future would look for Australia. You know, Donald Horne being one of the people who expressed that view, Hancock being another. It was quite interesting to read that. It made me feel a little bit anxious, actually, I must say, thinking, well, I don't think we've addressed some of the things that were raised.
Although I guess one of the interesting things is not all of them, but then some of them really did get nailed over the 80s and 90s. And, you know, as I said, one of the things that really struck me reading that collection is, boy, this is such a different place to 30 years ago, let alone 100 years ago.
I just want to make a conclusion thought. First of all, this is the first time I've met Lee, and I just love the pen throwing, the stories about ripping books up. It's fantastic. I'm going to watch 7:30. The different.
You should.
Any moment. Some work that I did in government in London before I came over here was published and then covered in a lot of press or FT and so on. And the Times did a kind of a series on it over the course of a few weeks. And one of the things that they wrote about it has kind of stuck in my head, kind of about government since then. It says governments are constantly overestimating what they can do in the short term and underestimating the difference they can make in the long term. And I think that so much energy and attention and so on goes into the shorter term stuff and too little into the longer term stuff, even though it's those longer term kind of things that will really make a difference.
That's because of outcome bias explained in Daniel Kahneman's book.
Well, but also I guess where it goes to is the importance of prioritising that long-term stuff, that you don't need to pick off many things to make a really big difference if you nail the big things the first time.
And you can't predict what things are going to turn out to make the long-term difference because it's very complex.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, look, let me wrap things up here. Firstly, can I thank Lee and Jane Francis for being wonderful interlocutors. I'd like to thank Federation Square for their facilities and their staff for all of their help. I'd like to thank Readings, whom I hope will be selling the books afterwards, and thank them for their cooperation in this. It's a partnership that we formed this year, and it has meant that we could ensure that all of these books would be available in Australia when we put the list out. Now is not the time to have a rant about the evils of parallel importation rules, but thank you very much to Readings. Up the back at the conclusion of this event, there'll be a table for the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation. We thought it was appropriate in this Christmas season to have someone that we could work with who could maybe approve the lot of others, not through government, but through their agency. So if you're interested in the kind of work that they do, there's a table manned up the back at the end of this event. And finally, can I thank the Grattan staff, obviously those who've helped put together today's event. Our events team make it all look very seamless, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that that's because they are paddling very, very hard underneath the surface. And I'd also, given that this is the last event for Grattan Institute this year, I'd just like to thank all the staff of Grattan Institute. It's been a great year. I'd like to think we've done a little bit to improve Australian public policy. As Jane Francis said, the key things that really make a difference always take a long time. And just very particularly amongst that group, I'd like to thank Peter Braden, one of our associates, senior associates, who did all of the work in terms of putting this together. And he was the one who had to kind of read the 40-book long list and therefore make all of the really tough decisions. And then finally, can I thank you, our audience tonight. It's been great having you here tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you can find one or two things to take away and read for your holidays. Thank you very much.